Welcome to this explainer. Right off the bat, we're diving into a massive logistical paradox found in some recently released intelligence analysis. The U.S. is currently spending exorbitant amounts of taxpayer money to fly Mexican nationals entirely around their own country just to drop them off in Central America. If you follow government spending or international relations at all, the physical and financial absurdity of these flight paths is wild. And today, we're going to unpack exactly why this is happening.
So, let's start with the central jarring contradiction. If authorities need to deport a Mexican citizen, the absolute simplest route is a practically free drop-off right at the border next door, right? Instead, the current operation uses U.S. military planes to fly these individuals thousands of kilometers away to Guatemala and Honduras. On its face, you're traversing or entirely circumnavigating Mexican airspace. It creates a massive logistical headache. So why take this incredibly extreme and costly route?
Well, when you compare the two options side by side, the difference is stark. A direct return to Mexico means short-haul flights, low costs, and minimal coordination, because those protocols have been established for years. In contrast, this third country removal involves long-haul military aircraft, massive expenses, and it forces the activation of highly complex bilateral agreements. The financial and operational burden is just off the charts.
To solve this mystery, we're going to break it down into four key areas. The deterrence multiplier, bypassing Mexican sovereignty, exploiting legal gray zones, and finally, the resolution.
Let's hit Section 1, the deterrence multiplier, and how geographic distance is being deliberately weaponized.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how drastically these deportation distances have escalated over the last 2 decades. Back before 2003, a standard return was maybe 0 to 50 kilometers away. Re-entry was pretty easy. Even by 2010, interior repatriation pushed that up to 3,000 kilometers. But jump to 2025 and beyond, this third country removal strategy pushes that distance to anywhere from 2,000 to over 4,000 kilometers, making re-entry incredibly difficult.
Seriously, let that sheer physical distance sink in for a second. 2,000 to over 4,000 kilometers. If a Mexican national is deposited in Guatemala City or Tegucigalpa, they are now facing a brutal, multi-country overland journey through foreign territory. This policy literally transforms a standard deportation into a severe multi-country barrier. And that massive distance pushes a very powerful self-deportation signal that works on multiple levels. First, you've got the direct hardship of being stranded without local resources or documents. But there's also the indirect deterrence. According to researchers, broadcasting this kind of severe hardship creates a climate of fear in migrant communities, which causes chronic anxiety and withdrawal from public services. Operationally, it also completely shatters a deportee's connection to established smuggling or coyote networks back in Mexico.
But here's the crucial point. The operation doesn't even need to be applied at a massive scale to actually work. Just the knowledge circulating through media and networks that the U.S. government might send a Mexican citizen to Honduras instead of home, that threat alone is the ultimate deterrent payload.
Okay, moving right along to Section 2, bypassing Mexican sovereignty and the intense geopolitical power play behind all this.
This is where the paradox really deepens. The Mexican Foreign Ministry has explicitly stated that they gladly accept the return of their nationals, and they fully reject these third-country deportations. So if Mexico is completely willing and able to take its citizens back, why on earth does the U.S. go through the immense trouble of flying right over them?
The answer is leverage. By bypassing Mexico, the U.S. sends a loud triple signal. First, it shows operational independence, proving it doesn't actually need Mexican consent to handle deportees. Second, it's a direct sovereignty challenge that bypasses Mexico's own stated policies. And third, it's a clear escalation warning that works right alongside tariffs and trade pressure, essentially stripping negotiating power right out of Mexico City's hands. But what about the countries on the receiving end? Guatemala and Honduras have fragile asylum systems and very minimal resources. So why do they agree to take these flights? Well, it comes down to highly asymmetric U.S. leverage. They accept these transfers not because they have the capacity to handle them, but because the cost of refusing U.S. pressure, like the threat of losing aid or facing harsh tariffs, is just way too high.
Let's dive into Section 3, exploiting legal gray zones. We're calling this the remove now, litigate later strategy.
So, legally speaking, the government relies on the Immigration and Nationality Act, Section 241B, Step 3. This allows removal to a third country if returning someone to their home country is deemed impractical, inadvisable, or impossible.
But as we just discussed, invoking this is highly contestable. Mexico explicitly leaves its doors open for its citizens. Returning them isn't impossible at all. It's practically effortless.
To back up their play, the administration leans heavily on a 2005 Supreme Court precedent, JAMA via ICE. This case established that the U.S. government doesn't actually need the explicit advance consent of a destination country to designate it for removal. They're using this precedent to claim incredibly broad executive discretion over these wild flight routes.
And this interpretation has created a massive ping-ponging legal battle in the courts. In 2025, a district court halts the flights. Then the Supreme Court steps in and stays the injunction, letting them continue. In early 2026, a district court again declares the practice unlawful. Weeks later, an appeals court grants another stay, allowing flights to resume. It's a persistent pattern of lower courts pushing back and higher courts letting it slide.
This dynamic perfectly illustrates a deliberate legal gap strategy. Step 1, execute the physical removals immediately. Step 2, litigate the legality in court later. Step 3, establish irreversible facts on the ground. Because the operational tempo of these military flights is incredibly fast, hundreds of removals happen before the courts can even catch their breath to issue a definitive ruling.
Now, impartially speaking, this strategy is raising severe due process and human rights concerns among lower court judges. They're pointing out that deportees often aren't given meaningful notice of the transfer, they have zero opportunity to raise fears of persecution, and there's a potential violation of the Convention Against Torture when it comes to chain refoulement. It is an intensely contested legal space.
Finally, let's wrap this up with Section 4, the resolution. Why this is absolutely a feature, not a bug.
When you connect all these threads back to our original logistical paradox, the intelligence analysis makes one thing crystal clear. The extra expense and the sheer logistical nightmare of flying around Mexico aren't a bug. They are the point. Traversing thousands of extra kilometers in military aircraft is a deliberate demonstration of political will, not some administrative oversight. It's a convergence of strategic motives. The administration completely accepts the financial absurdity because they get a massive deterrence amplifier in return. They secure a powerful geopolitical pressure tool against Mexico, they exercise asymmetric dominance over Central America, and they successfully exploit the slow pacing of the courts to keep the whole operation airborne.
So, looking at all the data, we're left with one critical question to think about. Does the sheer cost of this extreme deterrence ultimately outweigh the rapidly escalating diplomatic and legal risks? This has been Eyes on ICE Investigates. Find more research and articles at www.eyesonice.net.